All right, well, I just would like to welcome everybody to the Real Crusades History Podcast. As usual, I'm going to be hosting today. I am J. Stephen Roberts, and I have with me Scott Amos, who helps me out at Real Crusades History. Scott, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Stephen, and happy to be here today.
Yeah, definitely. So am I. And this is kind of an exciting podcast for us. We've got two brand new guests on the podcast. We've got Dr. Andrew Holt, who is a Crusades historian from Florida State College at Jacksonville. Dr. Holt, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Stephen. I'm looking forward to being on today's program.
Yeah. And we've also got with us historian Paul Crawford from the California University of Pennsylvania. So, Dr. Crawford, thank you also for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So our topic for this podcast is really kind of an evocative and striking one: the First Crusade as a defensive war. Sort of just that statement, I think, could rouse all kinds of controversy in the wild west of internet commentary out there. You know, we're talking about the First Crusade. The First Crusade is the beginning of the Crusades movement. I mean, you know, not just because it's called the First Crusade, but because it's the one that really launched the entire concept of crusading that would, you know, affect not only these campaigns in the Holy Land, but the Reconquista, the Crusades in the Baltic. And but the thing about that is that the First Crusade doesn't in any way represent the beginning of this issue of Christendom facing or confronting Islam. That had been going on for 4 centuries prior to the First Crusade, and indeed that long history kind of led up to, you know, the development of this concept of crusading that ultimately Pope Urban II put into action in 1095 when he delivered his speech at Clermont. So let's kind of look at that. Before we talk about the First Crusade, I want to ask the two of you about this relationship between Islam and Christendom in those first 4 centuries leading up to the First Crusade. So, Dr. Holt, let me start with you. I know that's kind of a huge topic, but what would you say to that?
Well, it's interesting you would ask, Stephen. You know, we have Paul F. Crawford on this program, and right now, when it comes to leading Crusade historians, he's literally, you know, one of the top guys in North America on this specific issue. He's published a journal article, 4 Myths of the Crusades. One of those myths covers this specific topic, and then more recently, he published a chapter in 7 Myths of the Crusades, of course, which many other Crusade historians, Alan Murray at Leeds, for example, have said is the most important chapter in the book. And so we've got the right guy here to talk about conflict between Christendom and Islam leading up to the First Crusade. And unlike some of the popular myths that there had been a peaceful coexistence for 5 centuries, for example, between Christendom and Islam before the First Crusade, he's the guy who has shattered that myth on a few occasions. And I'm even bugging him to consider writing a book that would be useful. But I'm going to keep bugging him until he finally agrees, hopefully. But anyways, maybe I could hand that over to Paul if he doesn't mind, because he is really becoming the authority on this. And then, of course, I'll be happy to chime in and add to it.
Absolutely, Paul. What would you say to that?
Well, as usual, Andrew is terribly kind to me and more kind than I deserve, but thank you, Andrew. It's nice to hear. The book in which the chapter on the First Crusade and Islamic Christian confrontation before the First Crusade appeared that's in a book that Andrew edited himself. So without Andrew and without Al Andrea, that book wouldn't have appeared. The idea that there was no violent or hostile confrontation between Christianity and Islam before 1095 is widespread in an awful lot of quarters. And I addressed this in that article, or chapter rather, in 7 Myths About the Crusades. Let me just read a couple of quotes that we have at the beginning of that article. There's a professor at Al-Azhar University who made the statement, "The Muslim nation has never attacked a neighboring nation." Voltaire said that Islam didn't establish itself over more than half of our hemisphere by force of arms. He said, and I quote, "It was by enthusiasm and persuasion."
Wow.
Yeah, enthusiasm and persuasion only. And John Esposito, who's a full and distinguished professor at Georgetown University, said that there were 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence that elapsed before political events and an imperial papal power play led to a centuries-long series of holy wars. In other words, there was no hostility before 1095. And that is simply, flatly not true, not supported by the documents in any way, shape, or form. But it's an idea that's very widely rooted in not just popular imagination, but as you can see from some of the quotes that I gave you from some more scholarly quarters too. And we could speculate about why that is, but it's there. It's just not true. Islam has been in violent confrontation to one degree or another with Christianity since about 634. So yeah, about 450 years before the Crusades. When people say, what do you say to this idea that there was no conflict between Islam and Christianity before 1095, one really hardly knows what to say other than it's just not true.
Recently, when I was visiting Turkey, actually, while I was there, I had a copy of this massive Byzantine primary source, John Skilitzes, I believe that's how you pronounce it, which is, I guess it's kind of one of those most important sources for really kind of this period leading up to the First Crusade, although it certainly wasn't written with something like that in mind, but it covers a couple of centuries, and it is just dominated by this really intense, continuous warfare between Byzantium and the various Islamic powers of Syria and Palestine and Egypt, mainly for control of what is today Turkey or parts of it, Asia Minor. And, you know, we get the same thing, of course, in the Iberian Peninsula, and there was long-running warfare in Italy.
Yes.
So it's just really striking, I mean, how such a really bizarrely inaccurate idea could become so widespread. So did you have any follow-up comments on that?
You know, I did, Stephen. Paul, of course, always says it best, but just to add a few other items, I think it was Bernard Lewis who was the first to estimate that there were about 2/3 of the Christian world had been conquered prior to the First Crusade by Muslim armies. Now, of course, this dates back to the early 7th century, leading up to 1095. And then after that, Thomas Madden picked up the 2/3 line, and so it's a number of scholars have used it, and I think it's a reasonable estimate, you know. And but like sometimes critics will say, yeah, but the Arab conquests were centuries before the First Crusade. No, they're missing out on continual conflict in the West. I mean, the city of Rome was sacked twice in the 9th century. In addition to that, the conflict continued off and on in Spain, and then more importantly, more pressingly, perhaps in the 24 years or so before the calling of the First Crusade, the Byzantine Empire and its holdings in Asia Minor and the surrounding regions were being overrun by the Turks after the Battle of Manzikert. Nicaea was captured, the ancient Christian city of Nicaea, where the 2 great councils were held. I think it was in 1084. I'd have to double check my date, but it was captured by Muslim armies. Antioch was captured within a few years of that date as well, 1088, I think, something like that, right in that time frame. And that's the city where Christians were first called Christians. You know, these were important cities within the Christian tradition, and these were overrun. And the Byzantines had been requesting aid for a long time, for decades, from the West. Pope Gregory VII had nearly led a force, he had called to lead a force of 50,000 Western Knights to go to the aid of Eastern Christians in 1074. And then there were continued negotiations, letters to Western nobility, letters to popes from the East, from Byzantine emperors, from ambassadors. In fact, at the Council of Piacenza, after Urban's papacy had finally stabilized in early 1095, at the Council of Piacenza, that was where Urban apparently first made the decision, okay, we're gonna do this, you know. And then at the Council of Clermont later that year, that's when the First Crusade was called. So this was an ongoing and continual thing, and this idea that everybody was living in peace and all these Christian groups were happy to live under dhimmi status in the East and everything is just so far-fetched that you know, I don't see how one can read modern scholarship by modern Crusade historians and come to those conclusions.
Yeah, very well put. And so I think what you've started touching on there, Dr. Holt, is this issue of what was going on in Christendom. Not just if we talk about those 4 centuries leading up to this, but that period immediately, kind of, as we get into the late 11th century, leading up to the First Crusade, things were changing quite a bit. And one of those issues is, of course, the rise of the Seljuk Turks, who were this new Islamic dynasty that rose to power and revitalized some of the older spirit of conquest that we found in the Islamic world. What was going on in the Christian world and the Muslim world sort of just leading up to the First Crusade with the Seljuk Turks and all that stuff?
You want to take that first, Andrew?
Yeah, I'll tackle it a little bit, Paul, and maybe you can come in behind me and do any cleanup batting that's needed here.
Should maybe add one little bit to support what you said, Andrew, a little bit before about the Christian world in Asia Minor, just before we leave that. Think about the New Testament, the book of Galatians, book of Ephesians. Those are areas in Asia Minor. These churches in Asia Minor from the book of Revelation, Pergamum, Philadelphia, Smyrna, Laodicea, those are all important Christian sites, and we never stop and ask why they're not Christian anymore. But Andrew pointed out why they were.
Yeah, and that goes for most of the Muslim world. I mean, Syria, in North Africa, was this long-running Christian civilization for a long time. So, but anyway, go ahead, Dr. Holt.
Go ahead.
Historians like to point to a number of movements. I suppose I would say that a lot of this begins in the post-Carolingian era. Not to go too far back, I don't want you to worry. But we do have the rise of the Peace of God movement, the Truce of God movement, where there's an effort on the part of the clergy to try to modify the behavior of knights and using spiritual authority to do so. And this over time, it starts to get established, this idea that the clergy, that these monks who maybe have never fought in a battle before, maybe some have, but maybe they haven't, have the right to sort of judge when warfare is appropriate or when it's not, when spiritual sanctions can be put against knights for attacking non-combatants, for example, or churches or church property or these sorts of things. And so the clergy starts to weigh in this sort of quasi-anarchy of the post-Carolingian period and become a more centralized authority in that sense. Now, I'm not saying all knights necessarily listen to the church or embraced it or they didn't continue to act poorly, but at least this seed is planted where the church begins to assert itself, and some knights do seem to listen. And then if we kind of walk from there into this investiture controversy, the Gregorian Reform era, in the decades leading up to the calling of the First Crusade, there's more conflict between secular rulers and ecclesiastical leaders over issues of authority that I won't bother to get into all the details here, but also conflict between the two. And so the church is increasingly asserting itself on matters of, more clearly perhaps than before, on matters of warfare, when warfare is just, when it's right for knights to fight, and these sorts of things. And then when you combine that with what's going on in the East, with the fact that Christian Asia Minor is being conquered by the Turks, is being overcome, the German pilgrimages in the 1060s are seeing mass slaughters of Christian pilgrims. When you combine that with all the Byzantine requests for military aid, it doesn't seem so surprising to me that Pope Urban II would see this as an example of where Christians could fight, where Christian knights could fight in a way that was on behalf of their fellow Christians, Eastern Christians, in a way that would not be necessarily unpleasing to God as long as it's done with the right intentions and these sorts of things. And so there's a lot of concurrent things coming together, I think, that lead to the calling of the First Crusade. But of course, my friend Paul, who always sees things more clearly than I, states them more clearly, frankly, I'd encourage him to please add on to that and let us know what you think.
By all means, Dr. Crawford.
You did a really good job there, Andrew. There's not very much to add. You're absolutely right. And on both the Christian and the Muslim sides, the things, the events, the intellectual currents that go together to make possible the Crusades are very, very complex. And even if there was no ideology or politics involved, it would do the reality of what happened a very grave disservice to try to reduce it to the simplicities that you find in news magazines' accounts of the Crusades in on sale in the grocery store aisle. It's just hopeless to try to get truth out of such a complex historical phenomenon.
Paul, if I could jump in, Paul said what you see in the aisles of grocery stores, the publications, and he immediately brought my mind to U.S. News and World Report in 2002. They put out a magazine cover, and it was in the this is post 9/11, of course, and it said something along the lines of the First Crusade, and the subtitle was "When East and West First Met on the Battlefield."
Yep,
that was the first conflict.
What a bizarre statement.
Reconquista, the Arab conquest of Christian North Africa. I mean, on and on and on. But I'm sorry, Paul, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're absolutely right. And to be honest, Andrew, that was in my head too. That and a number of other Newsweek's done it. I think all the major news magazines have done it, and they've, even if they were doing it in a spirit of goodwill, they all got pretty far from the mark, I'm afraid, because they start out with modern assumptions and then try to overlay them on historical events that are a millennium or more old, and it just flat doesn't work. Stephen, I don't know, were you wanting us also to talk about the Muslim side of this pre-Crusade background?
Absolutely, sure.
Well, the Muslim side was equally complex to the Christian side, and there was not a unified Muslim world confronting the Christian one. Osama bin Laden tried to create the impression, and maybe he believed in it himself, that there was this unified Muslim Ummah before the 19th century or 20th century, he seemed to think, and that's just not true. The Baghdad Caliphate had been captured and basically dominated by Seljuk Turks in 1055, Turks who were originally pagan and were converting to Sunni Islam. They came in as mercenaries, then overthrew the administration that was being run by Shiites, casting themselves as Sunni defenders of the Baghdad Caliphates, but in fact taking control of them. And then in the process, as they did that, they shattered what unity there was in the Middle East at the time, and the whole area devolved into a collection of competing emirates who were all too happy to attack each other and couldn't get their act together, their Sunni act together to fight the Shiite Fatimid Caliphate that was in Egypt, had been there from 909. So when the Crusaders come into the Middle East in 1095, they find not a united enemy, but a mosaic of competing Sunni states, Shiite states, Armenian Christian states, a band of Armenian Christian states from the, along what we would call the southeastern corner of Turkey today on towards the top of Iraq. All kinds of people doing all kinds of things, and some of them were happy enough to side with the Crusaders when they entered the area.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that even the Seljuk Turks themselves at that point were rather divided, with the various Seljuk princelings of, Aleppo or Antioch or Damascus kind of not really cooperating, and maybe even wanting to take advantage of the Crusaders attacking their brother-in-law or whatever it was. A well-known Muslim chronicle, Ibn al-Athir, who talks about events leading up to the First Crusade and this rise of the Franks. He talked about the recent victories in Iberia. Toledo had recently been captured by Alfonso VI. The Normans had taken Sicily. And I guess we could say there was kind of this new energy coming out of the West, and they were for the first time really able to push back against the Islamic world in a really meaningful way. Pope Urban II's call of the First Crusade is this really fascinating event in history. What was he thinking? What were his motivations? How was he conceiving of this? And one of the most striking things in his speeches, of course, he has these descriptions of atrocities committed by the Seljuk Turks. And I think it's kind of a commonplace to say, the idea is the Seljuk Turks were committing these atrocities against Eastern Christians in the Holy Land, in Palestine and Syria, and he was sort of bringing this up to the knights of Western Europe. Look at what's happening. You need to do something about this. And he talks about these incredible acts of brutality. And I know there's kind of this tendency maybe in the popular culture to sort of look at that and say, well, that was kind of just wartime propaganda. That was sort of baseless. He was just trying to stir up the troops. But the interesting thing is, if we look at a lot of Eastern chronicles, we can almost see discussions of atrocities like that almost reflect what Urban II was talking about. Even some Muslim chronicles. I know, like if we look at some descriptions of the Turkish conquests of the Armenian territories, like for example the city of Ani. How much did Urban II know about what was going on in the East? How aware was he? And I know one issue that you brought up in some of our discussions online, Dr. Holt, was this interaction diplomatically between Pope Urban II and the Byzantine Emperor at the time, Alexius I Comnenus. So did you want to kind of talk about that a little bit? What was going on between these two important figures?
The Pope had been receiving correspondence detailing various atrocities in the East, but it wasn't just correspondence. Pilgrims had been coming back for decades describing how things had changed dramatically in the East. Some of this harassment of Christians in the 11th century, I guess it could date back to 1009, right, Paul? Al-Hakim's sacking of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But certainly more significant changes start taking place in the middle of the century. And so Westerners had been aware that there were problems in the East. They'd been hearing it from pilgrims. They'd been getting Byzantine correspondence. They'd been receiving ambassadors. There's even a well-known source, a letter to Count Robert of Flanders. And while the source itself may not be original, scholars do think it might be based on another source, an earlier source. And then it was rewritten later in the time of the Crusades. And maybe some hyperbole was added to it, but maybe not. We're just not sure what it was based on initially. But the accounts you get in some of Pope Urban's accounts of his speech, and there were some eyewitnesses that attended this speech, even if they wrote down their comments later, sound very similar, to what you hear in this material. One thing I would point out, some of it sounds fantastical. An undergraduate reads this. It sounds like maybe the Pope is just pushing sheer propaganda because people wouldn't really be that horrible. Look at the modern Middle East. Look at what the Islamic State is doing, to their people. We get these fantastical stories today. Well, people 900 years from now say, oh, that was just Western propaganda. It is right. Certainly in the realm of possibility, and there's certainly some historical sources justifying it. Go ahead, Paul. Sorry.
No, that's fine. You're on a roll, Andrew. That's a good job. But let me just underscore that remark that you made, Andrew, about the atrocities. I have heard the same thing that you're mentioning. People look at what Urban said, they look at what other people said in the 11th century, and they say propaganda, exaggeration, hyperbole. I was asked a couple of years ago to give a talk on martyrdom on the part of Christians to Muslims throughout the centuries. And it covered really from the earliest years of Islam up until the 21st century. So I was looking not only at historical sources, but also at news reports. And I was struck by the similarities between the news reports. This was in the summer of 2014. The news reports that I was reading out of northern Iraq and Syria in 2014, and the text of Urban II's speeches as they're variously reported, and other documents. I was also struck by the fact that there was a constant, steady drumbeat of these atrocities, and we in the West mostly weren't paying any attention. But if you go and look at the documentation, it's all there, and there's a lot of thoroughly horrendous stuff in it. So I know I've very much heard people saying this is propaganda, this is exaggeration. And of course, it might be, but it sounds awfully like what we're getting on the news today, as you said. And something else that needs to be pointed out is that Urban was not the first pope to be appealed to by the Byzantines. Byzantines appealed to Gregory VII back in about 1074. And Gregory VII announced his intention to lead himself a military expedition to help the Byzantines and drive back the Muslims. And you can trace his plans for this expedition if you look at his register, which in fact has been translated, so it's accessible to people who can't read Latin. And then those plans stop in 1076, suddenly and completely. And anyone who knows anything about medieval history knows what Dr. Holt already mentioned, which is the investiture controversy starts, and poor Gregory has no more time or attention to spend. But Gregory wanted to do it and was responding to the very same kinds of reports that Urban II finally responded to as well.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. Scott, did you have something you were going to say?
What was the collective memory of the common person in Europe at the time of conflicts between Islam and Christendom?
There is actually a good answer to that. You kind of have to define common person. What was their understanding?
Yeah, what was their understanding of Islam? What was their understanding of the events that had happened centuries before? I mean, was Charles Martel a folk hero? You know, that kind of thing.
Yes.
What passed down?
Mm-hmm. In the 11th century, the idea was pretty shadowy, really. Their details were not very precise. The Song of Roland, the Chanson de Roland, Muslims in that chanson are presented as enemy. They're presented as pagan and polytheist, which of course isn't true. The understanding of Islam as a religion and as a political entity is not very clear on the pages of the Song of Roland. They're enemies, they're dangerous, they need to be fought, and beyond that you get into some kind of factually shaky areas. Andrew, do you know of any other way?
Yeah, let me just jump in and add a few things, I guess. In one of the accounts of urban speech, at least one, he refers to Charlemagne and the deeds of your ancestors, the Franks. And so presumably for his audience, these mostly French nobles in Clermont, that would have been a recognizable symbol, Charlemagne's battles against, and then also, but in the West, I know that references and sources, Western sources, Western European, Western Christian sources, go back at least to Bede, the Venerable Bede in the 7th century, referring to Muslims, and in one fashion or another. But like Paul mentioned, they're not always very accurate in their understandings of Islam and how it works and this sort of thing. But in Christian Byzantine sources, I might add, of course, Byzantine Christian, Eastern Christian sources, there are many, many more references to Muslims there. And in the 7th century, as the Arab conquests were taking place and as big chunks of the Byzantine Empire were being overrun or captured, Byzantines would often ascribe their losses to God being upset with them. In other words, they as Christians had somehow sinned, and so these Muslims were acting as sort of a scourge of God. It's interesting, in the sources of the First Crusade, I've done a study of this. If you look quite often, whenever there's a setback, at Antioch, for example, before the final conquest of Antioch was completed, the Crusaders wondered why. They were having problems, and their clergy told them, well, you guys have been sinning, you haven't been faithful to your mission, and so they all go to confession, they make a procession, and then they try again. And so within the First Crusade, you see a sort of standard that if they lose in battle, if Muslims are victorious, there's this sort of common understanding that it's because they as Christians had failed God, because you don't win holy wars, you don't win a crusade without having God on your side. And the way you keep God on your side is through personal holiness. But I might also add, as early as the 12th century, you have the first Latin translations of the Quran. By the 12th century, of course, awareness of Islam in the West, at least in some quarters of society, is much better.
Yes, and you get scholars, monks, and other clerics who are specifically studying Islam in order to try to counter it by missions and by argument rather than by military action. And some of them had a lot of hope that would prove to be the answer to blocking and stopping Islam. Of course, they were wrong. It did not. I'm thinking particularly of the great Catalan writer Ramon Llull, but there were plenty of others too, who had a really pretty good idea what Islam was talking about by the time you get to the 12th and 13th centuries, but not so clear before that, unless, as Andrew, you said, you're talking about Eastern Christian scholars, and then some of them were very good very early. One thinks of John of Damascus in the 9th century, I think, who had a very he worked for Muslims, he worked around them, he lived his entire life under them, and he knew exactly what they were doing. In fact, John has a very interesting discussion of Islam in his text in which he describes heresies. He considers Islam to be a heresy, and he talks about things in the Quran, including a section of the Quran that apparently was in it in his time period and isn't anymore. He knew something about the Quran before it had changed a little bit. So if you want an accurate Christian view of Islam before the 11th century, you need to go to the eastern part of the Christian world. The Western one takes a while to catch up because they don't have very close contact with them.
Yeah, fascinating stuff, guys. The big question of this podcast: why should we view the First Crusade as a defensive war? Dr. Crawford, how would you kind of summarize that question?
When you have one side that has been more or less relentlessly attacking another over half a millennium, and the attacked side finally counterattacks, it's pretty obvious to me that that's a defensive war. From the Eastern Mediterranean to Italy to Spain to southern France to North Africa, Christians had been under, if not constant, at least continual assault for 450 years. The Eastern Empire had counterattacked several times, most notably in the 10th century with some success. But the Western Empire, after the collapse of Charlemagne's empire and after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire even earlier, didn't have the military and economic strength to mount a counterattack. They began doing it in the 11th century before the Crusades. If you stop looking at the church and stop looking at directly religiously controlled conflict between Islam and Christianity, you find that the southern French and the northern Italians were engaging in some small-scale counterattacks in the 11th century and had finally begun a couple of times sending raids, powerful raids, across the Mediterranean to strike the bases in North Africa from which the attacks on them were coming. In one Italian city-state, the City Chronicle talks about, I think it's the 1084, campaign against North Africa, and the entry that follows that discussion of their city's participation in an attack on Muslim North African sites. The next entry after that is the entry that deals with that city's participation in the First Crusade. And it's quite obvious in the way that those occur together that they're thinking of this as a continuum. We got attacked, we finally fought back across the Mediterranean into North Africa, and now we're taking the fight back further to its source. If you read the primary sources with the humility to pay attention to them, which not everybody does, it's simply inescapable that these people were defending themselves and mounting a counterattack.
You know, just to shift the question just a little bit, why is it important to understand the First Crusade as a defensive war, as largely a response to, again, keep in mind, 2/3 of the known Christian world had been conquered by then. It's not the other way around, you know. Rome had been attacked multiple times, Mecca never. And so there are some distinctions there. But why is it important to frame it this way? Well, as a defensive war, think about just one example. In the modern day, modern Salafist movements that inspire groups like Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, a whole bunch of sort of ghastly characters that are operating throughout the world today. One of the ways they accent their propaganda is by highlighting the Crusades as an attack on a peaceful Islamic world that was just minding its own business, and no Muslims were hurting Christians, and none of this stuff was going on. And so it was Christians who initiated the attack, they'll argue, and this is part of their propaganda. I mean, look at the Islamic State. Over 40,000 foreigners have gone to join them in Syria and Iraq over the last 2 years alone. You know, they have 8,000 fighters now in Libya, 7,000 in Nigeria. They have standing armies in Egypt and several other places, and they're growing, and they have this powerful online propaganda machine where they're spreading this kind of details. I mean, in their major publications that are issued by their caliphate, their so-called caliphate, they mention crusading rhetoric all the time, and they present this twisted narrative that's meant to inspire young, passionate Muslims that aren't very well educated or very well informed about history in general, much less the Crusades. And this is one of their tools. And so for real Crusades history to be online and to be combating this narrative, it's an important task, an important job. And so, you know, my hat's off to you guys for doing it.
Yes,
Thank you very much, Dr.
Thanks.
Yes, let me add something to that, too. They also, not only do they contribute to the morale of their own recruits, they also undermine the West's belief in its own cause,
Yes.
the belief in its own justification for defending itself, which is pretty serious. If you raise the morale of one side and lower the morale of another, that can have a pretty serious effect on the outcome of the conflict, and I think that's what we're seeing to some degree.
And I think they have plenty of support from the left on that as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. Very well put, gentlemen. The Crusades really emerge out of this world that had been sculpted by the Islamic conquests. When we look at Christendom prior to the rise of Islam, there had been no concept really of holy war or how a military campaign could be spiritually meritorious. I mean, there was an idea of just war, but that's very different than this concept of sort of martial spirituality that came out of the Crusades. And really, it is the result of this experience of 4 centuries of struggle, desperate struggle in many circumstances. I mean, we look at history of the Iberian Peninsula, what was going on in Italy, the fact that really the whole Mediterranean had kind of been turned into this giant launching pad of piracy, directed against the Christian world. And you look at a pope like Urban II emerging from that history. That's the product. The result is that there is a kind of a new theology and a new spirituality that develops around this concept of fighting back. So it's almost impossible to imagine the Crusades without jihad. And of course, jihad is this is ready-made at the start of Islam. I mean, it's kind of there from the inception. Muhammad himself engaged in jihad. So yeah, this has been a really interesting discussion that we've been having. I guess what we could say is, oftentimes we talk about the Iberian Peninsula and the wars there as the Reconquista, this effort on the part of the Christians to take back their territory. The Crusades really it's a similar thing. I mean, we could say that the Crusades to take back Syria and Palestine were a kind of Reconquista. And so it's fitting, and after the First Crusade, the Iberian Peninsula is going to become a part of the Crusades movement, and so really it's this 2-pronged approach, as far as I can tell. So,
go
ahead, Scott. Sorry.
No, I just wanted to add something. At the time of the First Crusade, where was Western Europe, the Western European states, in terms of actual danger, actual immediate danger to that geographical area itself? From Islamic invasion. Where were they then? I mean, when we speak of it as a defensive war, just to get into defining it a little more clearly.
Scott, let me jump in here. It's interesting. I mean, by the late 11th century, Western Europe, and Paul can correct me where he thinks best, but as I understand it, Western Europe is really emerging at that point. I mean, the Emirate of Sicily, which lasted from the 8th through 11th centuries, had ended. Christians were on the offense in Spain. In fact, crusading had expanded to parts of Northern Europe and against heretics, by the early 13th and so on. And so, in a sense, what you see is a sort of expansion of Christendom back to maybe its original borders, one might say. I mean, where there is a push. So Western Europe isn't necessarily, unless I'm missing something, and Paul will correct me if I am, isn't necessarily under threat at that time. But Christendom itself is under threat in the sense that Eastern Christians, in the sense that Christ's patrimony, Jerusalem, the Holy Land, in the sense that you've got Christian emperors of what was once the most powerful medieval Christian state, the Byzantine Empire, pleading for help, from Pope Gregory VII to Pope Urban II, sending ambassadors to Piacenza, sending letters to members of the nobility, in addition to clerical authorities, and so as the West becomes stronger and more stable, it can finally turn its attention to the East. And what was going on in the East met the conditions of the evolving thinking, Christian thinking in the West on when warfare is acceptable.
Spanish Muslims had taken Sardinia in 1015 in the 11th century. Salerno was besieged in 1016, 1017. There were raids, serious attacks. It's true that the Spanish and French and Italians had largely pushed the Muslims off of the European mainland north of about 2/3 of the way through Spain. But it's not true that they were not under military pressure from Muslims. They were. Even into the second half of the 11th century. So there's military conflict, there's military confrontation. Some of the threat had, as Andrew said, abated, certainly, but there is still military interaction, and it doesn't all go in the Christians' favor, even into the second half of the 11th century.
Okay. Did you have anything to add to that, Dr. Holt?
No, of course. No, I agree entirely with Paul. I do think Christendom was becoming stronger, but he's absolutely right. I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that they had nothing to concern about, nothing to be concerned about to their south or to their east in some cases, and so on. So absolutely, I agree with Dr. Crawford.
But yes, right. Of course you're right, Andrew, that they had really got to their feet. They had the economic resources, they had a degree of political stability, a degree of military success that was going to enable them to make these larger counterattacks. So the wind had shifted to their side, to use a climatological metaphor. But they're still in hostile confrontation and hostile contact. So, and from their point of view, the fact that they have the upper hand is a pretty recent development. And I think, and comment on this, Andrew, it seems to me that it would be reasonable to infer that they would have felt that was a pretty tenuous state of affairs, would they not?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Absolutely. In the charters, for example, of the Crusaders who went to the Holy Land, not participated in other theaters, but to the Holy Land, much of their focus was on what was happening with Eastern Christians, of course. Jonathan Riley Smith's done research on this, as have others, looking at what their concerns were. And some of them write very explicitly about what they're hearing, about what's going on in Jerusalem, for example, what's happening to Eastern Christians. Many of the sources of those headed to the Holy Land seem more focused when we talk about immediate threats on what was happening with Eastern Christians. I guess that's what I was trying to get at earlier. That seems to have been where most of their focus was. And even in Pope Urban's speeches, he would emphasize, what's happening in the Holy Land and so on. And because, that's where he's sending them all, right? So, I mean, and that's where the Crusaders that are participating in the First Crusade are going. But if we were to look at crusading charters from those who had taken vows in Spain in the 11th century or in Italy or in other areas, of course, the emphasis would be very different. So.
Well,
that's an excellent point, yeah.
Would you say that Alexius was anticipating an immediate invasion at that time from Anatolia?
Well, he had already suffered the loss of pretty much all of Christian Anatolia, right, Paul? I mean, at one point they were up to the walls of Constantinople, and
Nicaea was
in Turkish hands.
Yeah, the First Crusade restored much of Asia Minor to Byzantine control. Right. The Byzantines came out quite well in terms of the final results, in terms of territorial possession by the end of the First Crusade.
I guess my question is was he anticipating an immediate attack, or was he looking at a preemptive strike to prevent that's.
I don't have a specific source I can cite, but in my generalized sense is that he was always worried about continual Islamic encroachment, his ability to deal with these forces. Paul might have something better to offer on that more specific.
When I say attack, I'm thinking in terms of a major invasion, crossing the Bosporus and besieging, actually invading besieging Constantinople and moving further west or farther west, that type of thing. Was he worried about that in an immediate sense?
It would be hard to get inside Alexius's head, because that's somewhere that only Alexius was, and it's hard to say exactly what he was worried about. But, well, like Andrew said, what he was reacting to was a very serious invasion that had taken the breadbasket, the resource platform away, and had taken their recruiting grounds away. So he's already had the invasion. He's desperate to throw it back, and he knows that the survival of the empire depends on its being thrown back. I am not enough of a 11th century, 12th century Byzantine military historian to know if it would have been possible for the Seljuks to have taken Constantinople at that point. I think it was not impossible. Wouldn't you agree, Andrew? And I think that Alexius would have known that. So I think he had good reason to be concerned, and he had the best of reasons to be desperate to get Asia Minor back.
Absolutely. Great point. Well, this has just been a really fascinating discussion that we've been having here. So we've had Dr. Andrew Holt and Dr. Paul Crawford with us for the Real Crusades History podcast. I think we've really covered this topic pretty thoroughly. I just want to see if there's anything else anyone would like to add as sort of a final point to this topic. Dr. Holt, Dr. Crawford.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, I guess not. I don't really have anything that I can think of. Paul will probably say something, and then my mind will go spiraling out of control. Well, wait a minute, I got to say this. But no, I think it was a good discussion. I think you guys really run a tight ship there with Real Crusades History. I appreciate everything you're doing, and thanks for the opportunity to come on here. So,
Thank you so much, Dr. Holt.
Certainly.
Yes, you are greatly to be praised for the work you're doing. And since Andrew's too modest to mention it himself, let me mention that he runs an excellent blog.
Yes.
Andrew, do you want to give people the information for finding your blog on the web and looking it up? Because there's some very good stuff there to read.
Sure, it's just apholt.com. And I might mention you can also read a profile on Paul F. Crawford, where he answers some questions as well on some of the things we've been discussing, and that's an excellent read. So if you go to my blog, that's the one thing you should read.
Yes,
the only
I've
thing.
been here.
Yeah, Dr. Holt's blog is really impressive. I've just found some fascinating stuff there, and I'll be posting the link to that in the About box for this podcast. So thanks very much, Dr. Holt. And Dr. Crawford, where can people find out more about your work and your research?
Well, I published an article about 5 years ago, as Dr. Holt mentioned, in Intercollegiate Review. That's available on the web. I think there's a fairly long URL for it, but the way I usually find it is asking Google to bring me to Crawford Myths Crusades, and it pulls it up pretty quickly.
It's an excellent article. I signed it in my classes, by the way. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Well, we'll get the link for that and put that in the About box as well.
Oh, I want to add, I have now read 7 Myths of the Crusades, and there will be a review upcoming on Real Crusades history for it.
Wonderful.
Excellent.
Thank you, Scott.
I guess that's the other thing that I would
Great
recommend
book.
to the listeners here is that they read my chapter in 7 Myths of the Crusades, because it pretty well details.
Yours was the best chapter,
Well, thank you very much. That's very kind
Dr.
of.
Crawford.
Thank you.
It was a great introduction to the book. I guess I wouldn't classify it in the breakdown of the reading list we're putting together as beginning reading, but it would certainly be in the next stage.
That's probably the right place to put it, yes.
Yeah, 7 Myths about the Crusades. That's certainly on my reading list, and we can link to the page for that on Amazon for the description in this podcast as well.
Yes, it's not an expensive book. It's $20 in paper, isn't it, Andrew?
Yes, it is. $19. They wanted to keep it under $20. The press did in hopes that it'd be picked up in classrooms.
Yeah, it's not a very big book, and it's a pretty easy read. There's some very interesting other chapters in there, too.
Great. Well, Dr. Holt, Dr. Crawford, on behalf of Real Crusades History, I'd just like to say thank you very much to both of you for being with us.
Thank you, Stephen and Scott, both. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. Thanks to both of you. And also, I should mention, thanks to Scott for getting me up and going on Skype. He's very patient with me.
Oh yeah, I mean that's what we do for our guests. If they need any kind of technical support, we are there. So
Stephen, you need to give Scott a raise then, okay?
on the way.
Okay.
So great. Well, this has been the Real Crusades History podcast. We do a new podcast every first of the month. I'm J. Stephen Roberts, and you can find us on realcrusadeshistory.com. Thanks very much. My new book, Why Does the Heathen Rage?, a novel of the Crusades set during the reign of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, is now available in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. Please click on the link in the About box of this video to get your copy. Also, if you would like to support Real Crusades History by offering a donation, you will find a PayPal donate link in the About box of this video. Thank you.